tonight's Searching for the Truth, sponsored by West 65th Street Church of Christ in Little Rock.
Welcome to Searching for the Truth, a live and local call-in program. Call in with your comments or questions now at 1-855-568-1062. That's 1-855-568-1062. Your friends at the West 65th Street Church of Christ in Little Rock, Arkansas invite you to open your Bibles and study with us as Don McClain answers Bible questions with Bible answers in a search for the truth. This program is presented to you as part of the efforts of the West 65th Street Church of Christ in Little Rock to search for all the truth presented in God's Word and teach that truth to men and women who, like us, are searching for the truth. Now, here's Don McClain.
And good afternoon. Welcome to Searching for the Truth. It is a nice day. A little windy outside, got a little chilly, overcast. There were some bad storms in the state last night, but, thankfully they were not as bad as they could have been. Had I think, one tornado touched down last night in the state, and after the weathermen talk it up, you think, well, it's fixing to be really, really, really bad, but fortunately it wasn't. So glad to know that as far as I have seen, everything is well today after the storms. Well, James Hamilton's with me today. James, good to see you, man.
Glad to be here again.
It is a privilege, and we're going to be turning our attention back to the subject of patience today. And if you have a question or comment, though, give us a call, 1-855-568-1062. Doesn't have to be regarding the subject that we're discussing. Any Bible question that you have, we'd love to hear from you. 1-855-568-1062. 1-855-568-1062. You can also contact me by email at donmcclain@sbcglobal.net, and check out our website, w65stchurchofchrist.org. James, we were talking about patience. We were really defining it, talking about its nature, its characteristics yesterday afternoon. What do we mean when we see the word patience in the Scripture? What's it talking about?
Especially it's talking about endurance to make it through hard times, persecutions in many cases, and just keep on doing what God wants you to do. It's not a passive thing.
It's not a passive thing. It's very active. And so yesterday we were discussing the subject of patience. And as we begin today's program, I want us to turn to James chapter 5. And we were there at the end of the broadcast yesterday, and we were talking about the farmer. And the farmer, in reality, has very little control over the things that are in nature. Only control he has is what, a little bit of an environment he may be able to create. Have you heard the story, James, about the scientist who put together this big dome, and they were growing all kinds of plants, including trees, in this big dome, and these trees just got huge, but they started falling over. They had restricted the amount of water and the amount of sunshine. They tried to create the perfect environment, but they left something out of the equation, and that was wind.
Yeah, they made it too perfect.
Yeah, the wind, no wind, and the roots did not set, and the trees began to fall over. So what would life be without trials and hardships and difficulties and storms?
Yeah.
And so as we look at the rest of this text today, if you, again, where you can, sit down and follow along with us. And we're going to open up right now to James chapter 5, beginning in verse 7. Like I said, we looked at that passage yesterday, verses 7 and 8, actually. But let's read them again. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Now verse 9. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. Again, the overriding message is to be patient. In the midst of the trials that they were experiencing, and you go back to verses 1 through 6, the rich oppress you, right? You're going through all these hardships because people do not treat you right, because you're a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So be patient. God's going to take care of it.
Yeah. You know, the example of Job's a very interesting one because he did not know the end. He says, you know the end intended by the Lord, but Job didn't know it.
No.
But he was still patient. And so there's the patience of hope where we know what to expect because God has said what he's promised. But we need to be patient and we need to do what is right even when we don't know how things are going to turn out.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because we don't know how it's going to turn out as far as, the physical or the material things in this world. We don't know.
But that doesn't really matter.
Those things don't. No.
Our hope is in what we have in store in heaven, reserved in heaven for us.
Exactly. And so it's we talked about yesterday. We think of the three elements of our Christian life. Faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. We all are very familiar with that. Patience is affected by each of those concepts. Each and every one of them, has something to do with patience. If I have a strong enough faith, what am I going to do? I'm going to endure. If I have a strong enough hope, what am I going to do? I'm going to hold on. I'm going to keep striving.
Mm-hmm.
If I have the love that I ought to have, I'm going to be long-suffering. I'm going to be kind. I'm just going to do what I'm supposed to be doing and letting everything else just take care of itself. God is going to take care of it, and really that's the reality of it. And so in this text, first of all, there in verse 7 again, there is a need for continuation. Like the farmer waits patiently for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently until it receives the early and latter rains. He's going through the process, waiting. But like you pointed out yesterday, he's not just sitting on a stump watching everything grow.
No.
He's out working the crop. I mean, he is in the garden, getting out the weeds, watering what he can, doing what he can to help the process along.
Keep the bugs out.
And that's a big task. So the need for continuance. Example, listen, God's provisions are there. We have to trust in God. And even if he had complete crop failure, was God going to take care of him?
Sure.
He may not have as much,
Right.
but he'll be given what he needs. God is a provider. He will provide what we need. May not provide what we want, what we desire, but he will provide what we need. And we need to trust in his provisions. And the point that we made yesterday about establishing your heart, that is laying that foundation, upon God, upon his word. Trust him. And so one more point, and then this is one that we didn't get to yesterday. Verse 9, do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. Complaining, when we're going through hardships, there is a natural tendency, isn't there, to complain?
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's frustration, hardships, and that's where people become impatient with the situation. Then they become impatient with other people.
Yeah.
And so they complain against each other. That's the timing of Korah's rebellion in the book of Numbers, is right after God said, okay, you're going to have it your way. You'll die in the wilderness instead of going into the land. And that's when the rebellion of Korah happened, was after that. So the morale was low, and that's what people will do. They'll complain.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Korah. That was one of the problems of the children of Israel. in general. They were always complainers. 1 Corinthians chapter 10.
Yeah, that. It just gives one example of several times in Exodus and Numbers where
we don't have
complained.
any water. We're going to starve. It'd been better for us to stay in Egypt. We don't have any food. It'd been better for us to stay in Egypt. We don't have any meat. It would have been better for us to stay in Egypt.
We don't want to go to the land of promise. Let's elect somebody to take us back to Egypt.
Because it's too hard because of the giants and the great walls and everything that's there. Yeah. We can't make it. And Moses, you just take too much authority on yourself. You're talking about Korah. And it's always complaining.
See, it wasn't Moses and Aaron's leadership to start with. It was God's leadership all along.
They
were complaining against God. Every time they come to a place where there was not food or water, it was God who led them there, not Moses and Aaron. They were complaining against God. Yeah. And so that's the thing about taking God's place when it comes to complaining against others. That's a kind of judging, and that's why he reminds you the judge is standing at the door. Mm-hmm. Jesus is the judge, and we are not the lawgiver. We're not the ones who have the right to comment on it in that regard.
In 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter is talking about really some of the same things. The end of all things is at hand. Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers, and above all things have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. We ought to be busy serving and doing what we can instead of murmuring and complaining about what's not being done. If more brethren, if more who profess to be Christians would stop complaining and just start doing, you'd be amazed at how things would change for the better. But okay, then one of the other things then that James makes a point of in verse 10, my brethren, take the prophets. Consider the prophets. Now, what about the prophets? You can go to go to Hebrews chapter 11. Of course, the whole chapter is dealing with faith. But once you get down to verse 32, 33, and it starts talking about all the different prophets, then what do we find about those prophets that relates to this particular subject?
Well, they all lived by faith, but some were saved from death because of their faith, and then some were faithful unto death and were cut in half, probably referring to Isaiah. That's the traditional concept about sawn asunder. That was Isaiah. And others who also died because the world was not worthy of them. So they showed patience. They endured very difficult hardships and persecutions.
And there are many examples of that in the scripture. Jesus, in fact, said that those who serve him will indeed suffer persecution. That's what the Apostle Paul told Timothy, and we've talked about that quite a bit on the program. But consider the prophets and their end. Oh, that's another idea, though, that consider the prophets. Okay, their end. Well, it was death, right? For the most part. I mean, that suffering, hardship, death. No, that wasn't the end, though.
No, not their end.
The end was their reward. No, go back to Hebrews chapter 11. What about Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1? Seeing we are encompassed about by such a great cloud of witnesses. What was this great cloud of witness that the Hebrew writer talks about?
All the people he talked about in chapter 11.
Yeah.
They ran the race. They finished it.
There you go.
With faith. And now they're watching us run the race. And the fact that they did it under the circumstances they had, they're witnesses to the fact that we can do it like Noah, even if everybody else in the world was wicked. Mm-hmm. We can't use that as an excuse because that's the way it was in Noah's day. Yep. And he still had faith. And even if we think we've been told to do something so hard by God that there's no way we can do it, no, Abraham can rise up and say, no, it can be done.
It can be done.
I was told to offer my only son, and I can do it by faith.
And if you're told, if you're told that nobody's going to listen to you,
mm-hmm. you still got.
You got Jeremiah. So regardless of the circumstances, we have all of these examples. These are men, by the way, just like us.
Yeah.
You know, they were human beings like us. Learn from them. Consider the prophets and their end.
Yeah.
They please God.
Yeah, I like what Jesus said about it in Matthew 5. He talks about, the great company you're in, because if you're persecuted, it's like the prophets were persecuted, and great is your reward. So you're in great company, and you're going to get a great reward.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so consider the perseverance of Job and the end intended by God. Like you said a while ago, James, Job did not know what the end was going to be.
No.
But God did.
And we know, because it's written in chapter 42.
Sure, I mean, we know, absolutely. We know what the ultimate end is going to be, although we may, not know all the details. We just know that we're going to be with God in His presence. And we have some description in human terms of that place, but how can human terms even describe that place? So there is clearly a need for faith, and trusting in God, because we don't know all the details. But consider the perseverance of Job and the end intended by the Lord. Job, everyone is familiar with the patience of Job. I had a caller the other day that mentioned Job. You can't talk about patience without talking about Job. What did he lose? You go to Job chapter 1, what did he lose?
He lost his children. That's bad enough.
That's as bad as it gets.
Yeah.
Well, you think that's as bad as it gets.
Well, he lost everything, and then his health. Only thing that the devil did not take away was something he could use against him, and that was his wife, to say, well, why are you suffering like this? Why don't you just curse God and die? Which could have just as easily been straight from the devil's mouth if he, being as crafty as he is, that's why he saved Job's wife. But
one of the
he got double in the end.
One of the interesting things that Job said in Job 1 and verse 21, he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Now, this is his response to this first wave of disaster that came upon his family, upon himself.
He knew that no matter why it happened, he knew it would be wrong to curse God and to reject God. So no matter what happened, he knew it would be wrong for him to curse God. Mm-hmm. And even when his wife told him to, and I call that the Kevorkian doctrine,
Yeah, absolutely.
We're just get over with. And of course, it's based on a lie that physical death is an escape. It's not. You lock yourself into that feeling for eternity, and it actually will be intensified. That's how the devil deceives people into thinking, well, there is no consequence to suicide, but it is. There is.
Job said in verse 22, in all this, or it said of Job in verse 22, in all this Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. That's in Job 1 and verse 22. Now, after all that Job had experienced, what was his response? You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. That's how he responded to his wife. So, we accept good from God, right? And shall we not accept adversity? In all this Job did not sin with his lips. Chapter 2, verse 10. Consider the endurance of Job, the long-suffering of Job.
And after he had to endure his wife's discouraging words, really, and then his friends come along, and they accuse him of all these things. They were actually preaching the devil's doctrine, and he had to endure that too.
Yeah.
It's enough to suffer physically, but emotionally, that's part of the burden they put on him when they began to accuse him. And we need to think about how much Jesus endured. In Hebrews 12, it was not only the physical suffering, but the humiliation of it. He despised the shame. In other words, the humiliation of the cross was not so bad that he was not willing to go through it. He knew the joy that was set before him, our salvation, is of much greater importance than the humiliation that he would temporarily have to suffer there on the cross, because that was the most humiliating thing that could be done, and the mockery leading up to it and while he was on the cross was just very cruel.
You know, you mentioned Jesus on the cross, and of course that's Hebrews chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6 says, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls." Even rejoicing in the midst of trials. You know, as you're experiencing the hardships, you know, the Apostle Paul said in the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 4, we'll flip over there real quick. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And what we find is the Apostle Paul really setting things in perspective for us.
Yeah, that's the key, is perspective. Knowing that there's a great value, and it actually is even more so, more appreciated if the more we go through.
Paul mentioned some of the suffering that he went through, and also the other apostles and those who preached the gospel. We, he says, plural, we, inclusive of the others who preached the gospel, we are always delivered to death. Okay? He says in verse 16, he says, "Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction," that's an amazing phrase right there. Our light affliction.
Well, yeah, just turn to chapter 11, you'll see how much he was persecuted.
But he says that's light.
Yeah, compared to something else, the reward that he's going to receive.
Our light affliction, which is but for a moment. You see, there's the perspective. Jesus had that perspective. He knew that this, cross, enduring it, was going to be temporary.
Yes.
The blessing would be forever. Okay? So this affliction, this light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are what? Temporary. But the things which are not seen are eternal. There's the contrast in perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so many have this temporal mindset. We're focused on stuff, on things, even on our fleshly relationships.
Yeah, just short-term benefits as well.
Yeah,
that's even true with some people in the spiritual realm. They're not looking at the long-term effects of their decisions as much as the short-term effects.
What gives me the greatest satisfaction and pleasure right now? That's what I'm after. Right now, what is it? Not realizing that the seeking out of fleshly enticement, pleasure, and success, materialistic gain, all of that's going to be taken away from you at some point.
Yeah,
it's all going to be gone. So we need a change in perspective, and especially when we're going through trials, how we need to alter our perspective to look at it from the perspective of Paul. These things are only temporary. We need to look not at the things that are temporary, but at the things that are not seen, which are eternal. Focus on the spiritual, right? How will that affect how we continue to live during our hardships? If we're looking at the spiritual, we're going to keep plugging on. We continue to pursue our hope. We, by faith, continue to march on into battle. We continue to fight. But what if we are temporal in our perspective?
And then we're just going to get caught up in in the world.
We're going to get caught up in the world for sure. Verse 12, James makes the point that we need to say yes and no. Don't swear. We need to be careful how we treat one another. The point, I think, mainly is we don't have any control over things. Just be the honest person that you ought to be. Live every day for God, and let everything else just take care of itself. Let God be in charge, really, because He's in control. Well, we're out of time.
The Church of Christ.
Till tomorrow. May God bless you. Have a great rest of
West
the day.
65th Street in Little Rock, Arkansas, has presented this program in the interest of searching for the truth. To request a past program, religious discussion, sermon CD, or religious literature, call 501-568-1062. That's 501-568-1062. You can email Don McClain by going to the church's website at www.w65stchurchofchrist.org. That's www.w65stchurchofchrist.org. If you'd prefer to write to the West 65th Street Church of Christ, the address is P.O. Box 190062, Little Rock, Arkansas 72219. Please join us this Sunday morning for Bible study at 9 a.m. and worship at 10 a.m. Sunday evening worship begins at 5 p.m. We also have a Wednesday evening Bible study at 7 p.m. You are welcome at any and all of these services. Tell your friends to tune in each weekday afternoon starting at 3 o'clock to Searching for the Truth on Faith Talk 99.5 FM, where we hope our efforts will help you as you search for the truth.